To understand why responsive design is such a useful technique for layout now, it helps to understand a little bit of the backstory. So, back in the beginning of the graphical web developers found that there were two real options when it came to general layout of a website. At that point, there weren't a ton of different ways to view the web. It was basically through a computer monitor, and computer monitors didn't have widely varying resolutions or sizes. So the two basic approaches were using a fixed or a fluid layout. With a fixed layout, the idea was you designed a website to be a specific width, and that width would be the width of the smallest screen that you would imagine the website being viewed on. So the smallest computer monitors out there. Or as computer monitors got a bit bigger, then you would build to the size of the most commonly used monitors, and then if somebody on a smaller monitor viewed that website, they just have to do a little bit of horizontal scrolling. Now, the alternative approach was to build a fluid website, which means that the site would expand or contract based on the size of the browser. For a long time, tables were used for this kind of layout, even though semantically that doesn't really make sense, since tables are supposed to present lists of data. But they were super useful for creating grids of graphics in a fluid type layout. So if you wanted a top left rounded corner and a top right rounded corner, and this was also before there were rounded corners in CSS, and you wanted to be able to expand a box so that it always had rounded corners regardless of what size it was, then a table was really the only way that you could do that. Now, a flexible layout would get a little funky if it got too small, because table cells don't collapse on top of one another, they just get smaller and smaller, and the text itself gets crunched into a very small horizontal space. But the idea was that normally people wouldn't make their browsers that small, so it wasn't a big deal. Now, at some point, web developers started gravitating away from using tables because they decided that the syntax of using tables as tables was more important, and some different techniques bubbled to the surface for creating a fluid layout, but without tables. And these worked pretty well. But because nearly every element in a fluid layout would change size as the browser got smaller or bigger, it really drove designers crazy, because they couldn't anticipate how their site was going to look in different sized browsers. They might have intended for a certain spatial positioning of things, but if the browser was slightly bigger or slightly smaller, it would really disrupt that visual continuity. So the idea of a responsive design is kind of a mix between fluid and fixed, and it's one that designers can also get into. The idea is that a lot of the elements on your page you will want to have a fixed width, but as the browser gets smaller, you may bump some of these fixed width elements on top of or below other elements, so that ultimately there are fewer columns of content on the page, until you get to the point where nearly everything is stacked one on top of another in a single column.